All right, welcome everyone. My name is Joanne Liebert and I'm here from Strides Toronto. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Kofi Belfon and his presentation, Alphabet Soup, Assessment, Formulation, and Treatment Considerations when Working with Black Youth. Dr. Belfon he received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Guelph and is registered with the College of Psychologists of Ontario, where he also sits on several committees. Dr. Belfon has more than 10 years of clinical experience in a variety of settings. In addition to his current role as Associate Clinical Director at the Child Development Institute, or CDI, Dr. Belfon also owns and operates a private practice in Durham. He has served on various roles and capacities at Kinark Child and Family Services, Ontario Shores Centre for Mental Health Sciences, SIL-APS Youth Centre, and the TDSB, to name just a few. He has taught courses at both the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also known as OISE, and Ryerson University, and is a member of the Board of Trustees for Strong Minds, Strong Kids. His research interests address chronic community violence, as well as the mental health needs of young people in custody and detention. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Kofi Belfon.
Thank you. I think I might have jumped the gun a little bit. Sorry, Joanne.
No worries.
So I think we'll wait a few more minutes just for people to join. And in the chat, as people are just getting on, if you could just hop in and indicate what program that you're from, say hello to everybody. I know that everybody's on mute, but that doesn't mean that we can't use sort of the chat function to stay connected before we get started, okay?
Yes, and also please be aware that we are recording this session, so just know that.
So don't say anything inappropriate.
And yes, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat.
So because it's being recorded, I'll try to be on my best behavior. Yeah, if you could just indicate where you're from, and certainly, like Joanne was saying, as questions come in, I will try to moderate the chat as much as I can, but it is probably much more likely that we'll reserve some time at the end for questions. Okay. We'll just wait a few more minutes as people join. I see a lot of my CDI colleagues joining in. I hope you're joining with good wishes for me. And I'm also hopeful that people had a good morning and were able to participate in some of the earlier sessions and that they were useful to you all and informative. So as people are joining, my hope today, I'll just fill you guys in a little bit about the chat. You might have gotten sort of the description with the advertisement. The formal talk is supposed to be we're going to try to address how systemic anti-Black racism has contributed to Black youth being disproportionately characterized, over-pathologized with disruptive and psychotic behavior by public systems. And we will discuss the impact that this has had on access to services, the contribution to undue suffering, and the need for better integration of cultural, racial considerations, formulation and treatment planning. We're going to do less on treatment planning, more on formulation probably. And we're going to discuss a little bit how awareness and cultural humility are important concepts in this, okay? And we're going to loosely follow, well, what I'm going to attempt to do is take you through a cross-sectional journey where you're going to meet different clients and people that I've had contact with over the years to explain some of the shortcomings in our work. Yeah, in our work with Black youth and in some of our systems that are aimed to support them. And so you'll meet different people, hear some stories about them. and we can consider how the end might, how in the end we can maybe collectively do better in the future. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so this is our agenda for the day. And again, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to most people because what it is just an accumulation of people. So you're gonna meet Caleb. The three main people that you're gonna meet are Caleb, Lisa, and Rich, with some people in between, okay? So let's get started here. I'm gonna start you off with a story. And the story of Caleb. So back in 2005, I was working at the TDSB following my first assessment practicum, and I was asked to do an assessment with Caleb. Caleb's a 7-year-old boy of Afro-Caribbean descent, single parent home, no contact with his father, living in a lower SES neighborhood in Scarborough. His mother worked nights, slept for large parts of the day. Due to her work, some babysitters were involved to watch the kids in the evenings. Mom was quite inconsistent responding to school requests, possibly due to her sleep schedule. She had lots of reservations about the assessment originally, but agreed to it initially because the principal was saying the next option would be considering a behavioral placement. Now, Caleb was engaging in some extreme behaviors at school, destruction of property, harming others, scratching himself, coloring all over his face with permanent marker, spitting on staff, constantly moving, running from class to class and school and within the school, outside of the school, not following adult instruction or redirection. Mom reported that his behavior was persistently kind of irritable. He wasn't sleeping at night. So during the course of the assessment, Caleb told me that his mom hit him with a shoe. And when I probed about it, he started to shut down. And so what did I do next? Well, I called CAS, and following that, Caleb wasn't at school for several days. And the next time I saw him in the hallways, he was shouting at me. He was shouting at me loudly, "Infama, infama, infama," and gesturing aggressively and kind of running toward me. And then the child and youth worker had to stop him. And needless to say that the mom withdrew consent for me to continue with the assessment. But there was still the matter of the assessment results in the report. And with only my master's under my belt at the time, I consulted with my supervisor who signed off on things. And we agreed that Caleb met criteria for pediatric bipolar disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. It's kind of the zeitgeist of like the 2000s. Today, the diagnosis might have been disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Perhaps that's slightly less stigmatizing. But my early mistakes, right, and I'm not particularly proud of. So, some trouble here. Do I not have control? Thank you. What have I done here? Well, I was in good company, basically, because data suggests that Black youth are disproportionately diagnosed with disruptive disorders, conduct disorder, ODD, even after controlling for ACEs, socioeconomic status, etc. One study showed that Black youth were 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with a stigmatizing disruptive disorder than same-aged white youth, and are less likely to receive a diagnosis of ADHD than their white counterparts. Far less likely, actually. So let's let that sink in for a moment. Even within live-in treatment facilities, Black youth are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder than whites. Similarly, Black people, particularly in the US, are overdiagnosed with psychotic disorders, There's a large body of research that supports this conclusion. The latter is largely related to two things. First, is this concept of cultural mistrust amongst Black people. Cultural mistrust is the idea that Black people have developed adaptive, paranoid behavior based on historical and contemporary experiences with racism and oppression. Now, second, and similar to what we see with the disruptive problems, is that clinicians are biased. And what does this mean? Why is this important? Well, because listen to the DSM-5 criteria for conduct disorder and ODD. ODD is a pattern of angry, irritable, often losing your temper, easily annoyed, angry or resentful, argumentative behavior, defiant, actively breaking rules, defying people, deliberately annoying others, blaming others for mistakes, vindictiveness. Conduct disorder is a pattern of behavior in which like the basic rights of others or major age-appropriate societal norms or rules are violated. This includes threatening and being violent towards others, stealing, sexually aggressive behavior, fire setting, destroying others' property, theft, running away, school truancy. These disorders are in the same category in the diagnostic manual that we use with kleptomania, pyromania, and antisocial personality disorder. And historically, they were clumped together with psychopathy. And the prognosis was viewed as dire and intractable a long time ago. And there are still some of those sentiments today. Whereas ADHD is nicely packaged as a neurodevelopmental disorder. Right? So talk about stigmatizing. Black youth getting labeled as delinquents or crazy, but white youth with similar presentations have neurodevelopmental disorders. So we need to get to the bottom of these race-based outcomes and better understand why it is that Blacks are disproportionately represented in these ways. So, why did I do what I did with Caleb? Why did I, as a Black man, with his own lived experience with racism in this country, turn around and diagnose Caleb with pediatric bipolar disorder and ODD? Not proud of it. I'm going to argue, though, that the reason for this is because we have our own biases regarding Black youth that contributes to how we assess and treat them, which are deeply rooted in institutional racism within clinical practice, which even Black men like myself are not immune to. If we take a quick look at option A from the last slide, although decades of racist research trying to reinforce the brute-like savage archetype has been debunked, isn't that basically how I characterize Caleb? We've learned that Caleb must be a savage. That's the depiction of him. He must be. He's violent, he's truant, can't be tamed, wild, doesn't listen to authority. Caleb runs around the classroom and we characterize him as aggressive. He's wild. Here we go. Where are the hazmat suits? Literally, where were the hazmat suits? That people would bring out hazmat suits. We gotta call mom to come and get him. But then Johnny runs around the classroom and everyone says he's hyperactive, he's impulsive. Parents say, oh, he must be bored. Are you guys challenging him? He's bright, and he needs to be challenged. Maybe that's not entirely fair of me, right? But you understand the picture. Where did these biases come from? This picture here is a picture of an exhibit at the Bronx Zoo in 1906. Okay, the Bronx Zoo. By the early 1900s, no longer were Black people being viewed by whites as doting, harmless, happy, overgrown, childlike figures, which were, by the way, initially espoused to get people to be more accepting of the concept of slavery. Yes, Sambo was born out of the need to justify slavery. Just think of the images, for example, of like Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben. But following the emancipation of slaves, white people needed to justify racial violence. This was further perpetuated by science and the portrayal of us as savages, and allowed for the continued justification of violence and segregatory practices to oppress Black people. These images are still perpetuated today and are deeply rooted in our history. Black youth as violent, dangerous criminals. Images molded by history, by white supremacists to keep us othered and dangerous to maintain supremacy. So I see this young Black boy, violent, aggressive, truant. Do these longstanding caricatures of Blacks lead us to this place? Well, let's see. I think, and it's not a novel idea by any stretch of the means, that these biases are perpetuated by past experiences and repeated exposure to images in the media, which maintain these biases. They're so insidious because people aren't aware of them. People like me, remember? Pediatric bipolar disorder, ODD. Really? You was 7. Right? Because these biases are silent, we end up behaving in ways that are inconsistent with our actual perceived beliefs about ourselves. I didn't think at the time that I diagnosed Caleb with those things that I was being harmful. I would have never thought that. I thought I was helping. So, and this is the thing, we are not better because we're in healthcare. Studies show that healthcare professionals are just as likely to have unconscious biases. And we hold them to the same degree as the wider population. And more specifically, studies show that we, healthcare professionals, view Black youth and other minorities as more dangerous and disobedient than white youth. We additionally hold biases about criminal behavior, aggression, violence, and hostility towards Black youth. We have lots of data on this related to implicit association tasks. You can find them online. You can actually test yourself around some of this. I use them in my research as well. I use these dot probe tasks related to this stuff to pick out unconscious biases. Bridges and Steen did some interesting work looking at attributions amongst probation officers and found that attributions of crime were directly linked to race. Officers made more internal attributions, personality, for Black youth and more external attributions, environment, for white youth. So if you're saying right now, that's not me, right? That's not me, that's not me. How do you know? Right? It happened to me. Have you done your own self-exploration? Remember, the biases are implicit. And I'm sure you're all aware of the story of Amy Cooper, so I'm not going to describe the story in detail. Do you think Amy Cooper, though, the woman walking in Central Park who called police on Christian Cooper, a Black bystander, knew that she had racist behavior in her? She lives in New York, donated money to Barack Obama, Pete Buttigieg, and probably considers herself a highly progressive person and thinker. So let's not focus so much on doing research about Black people or trying to learn about us to start. Let's do internal research, right? Let's figure out where our biases actually lie. The overt racist stuff in some ways I'm less concerned about. It's obvious, it's there. It's, people, we see that stuff coming. It's the unconscious stuff. That's the stuff that's leading to all of these diagnostic disparities. So, I started off by saying that there is institutional racism within our clinical settings. And I know that this, I know this is not only because of the preponderance of diagnosis of Black children as having disruptive disorders, which study after study has demonstrated. So there are things that we are obviously actively doing that cause harm, but also because there are things that we are not doing, questions that we're actually not asking. And so I was on internship working at a hospital in the GTA, and I was participating on a multidisciplinary team meeting where new clients that are being picked up, you present the cases to the team and see if you need psychiatric involvement, you get feedback on your treatment plan. It's a nice process. Right? And I was presenting this case about a 10-year-old Black youth I was working with, some disruptive behavior, and family had just moved out to Hamilton region for, anyways, it's a lot of change happening in his life. The psychiatrist stepped in and asked me, well, did you consider ODD? And I said, no, right? I didn't really take offense to it or anything. I just said no, and I explained why, largely related to the challenging context I was describing with respect to the kid he was living in. And anyway, she turns to me and says, the etiology doesn't matter. And this will stick with me forever, right? And I literally have not made a diagnosis of ODD since. It's been about 12, 13 years. So, WTF, right? But, you know, in a lot of ways, she was right, because there's nowhere in the DSM-5 related to ODD that says you have to consider etiology of the behaviors. I'm oversimplifying, but it's basically just a checklist of stuff that leads to the opinion. The only caveat that it gives really is that symptoms should not exceed what is normative in one's culture. So that's interesting, like, right? Like what culture? Subculture. Exposure to chronic community violence, poverty. Right? Is being on edge and reactively aggressive normative in that culture? So Caleb ends up getting labeled as a behavior problem because of my bias and because of the system and because we have a history that's helped us perfect these biases. But Caleb, you know, is Caleb actually a behavioral problem? Now, my hindsight allows me to say that he's actually a survivalist whose physiology's gotten all jacked up by the terrible things that have happened in his life. His fight, flight, freeze response system is in hyperdrive, messing up his ability to regulate himself. But he ends up getting viewed from a disruptive behavior lens because we're loaded up with all of these unconscious biases. But, you know, but we don't appreciate the impact that that has on prognosis for Black children and how it interferes with access to adequate treatment. So, what's the impact of Amy? All of our unconscious biases of institutional racism. What happens to Caleb? Well, again, I don't have the benefit of seeing my clients longitudinally. I wish I could. That would be really cool and important, actually. I don't have that benefit. So remember, I'm going to take a cross-sectional approach here and introduce you to another client that I was seeing in my, supervising a client that was being seen in my practice. Lisa. Okay. So Lisa, 17-year-old in the extended care of the society, right, diagnosed with ODD, ADHD, LD, comes from a family of 9 kids. Family immigrated to Canada serially from Jamaica. She was initially raised by her grandmother in Jamaica until her parents could send for her. Her parents were separated during the immigration process. Lisa had a lot of movement in her living situation when she was younger as a result, witnessed a considerable amount of domestic abuse as well. And she's the only child of 9 to be in the society's care. Think about that. The only one. Father lives in Toronto, has had very little contact with her, and actually recently put a restraining order against her. Her mother is refusing to have her in the home because of her attitude and behavior. She has a lengthy history of disruptive behavior. Lisa was physically aggressive in elementary school, attacking other kids, property destruction. Once she started school, the CAS call started originally because of physical, physical abuse, the use of physical discipline reported by the school, which she got into trouble for at home, putting the house's business in the streets. Her mother viewed it as being disloyal. Her mother then started calling both the police and CAS to say the behavior was unmanageable during Lisa's violent outbursts. Placement in behavioral classrooms, hanging out with unsavory peers, relationships are rocky and inconsistent, can't be tolerated by others, doesn't get close to people, no genuine relationships, smoking weed every day, arrests in high school because of assault, placed on diversion, alternative class placements, taking grade 10 courses, but she should be graduating this year. Right. Had another foster placement breakdown recently, and I can't count how many she's been in and out of over the years. Just being told her whole life that she's bad and that she won't amount to anything but pregnancy, OW, or jail. Lisa, this angry Black woman in all of our blind spots. Black women have been stereotyped as angry, and I don't have much else to say here other than it's wrong. Right? Lots of literature on this. But sadly, this mythology is still both perpetrated by the media and also perpetrated by Black men. We either get Black women portrayed as Jezebels related to sex and promiscuity, or we get the other historical archetypes of the sapphire. The Black woman is brutish, domineering, matriarchal, castrating of others. And this actually made for the current depiction of the angry Black woman. And it's just wrong. And a remnant of slavery, where Black women were physically abused and sexually brutalized, made to work, rear children of rape independently. So the characterization of Black women as angry ignores the utility that anger has served in the Black community related to survival. So I'm going to offer an alternative explanation. Again, it's probably not, earth-shattering. And that's that Black women like Lisa, similar to Caleb, are also survivalists. In the face of both current and historical social, economic, and political oppression, Black women have had to learn to survive. In our stress response system, we like to focus on flight and freeze, but we ignore the healthiness of fight. And Black women, both today and historically, have faced their share of hardship that necessitated fighting. Lisa's problem is not anger. I actually summarily dismiss the characterization of her as the angry Black woman. Her behavior is a normal response to an abnormal situation. She's a trauma survivor. And a badass trauma survivor at that. Take a moment and consider all of the things that have happened to her. Let's consider these questions for a moment. I'll read some of these to you, okay? Were your parents separated? Did you live in a house where someone served jail time? Have you saw or heard household members hurt or threatened to hurt each other? Were you in a house where someone swore at you, insulted you, humiliated you, or put you down in a way that scared you? Were you afraid that you might be physically hurt when younger? Were you touched in a sexual way that was unwanted against your will or made you feel uncomfortable? Were you living without food, clothing, a place to live, or had no one to protect you? Were you pushed, grabbed, slapped, or something thrown at you? Or were you hit so hard that you were injured or had marks? Were you living with someone who had a problem with drinking or drugs? Were you feeling unsupported, unloved, or unprotected? At any point in life, have you been in foster care, experienced harassment or bullying at school, lived with a parent or guardian who died, been separated from your primary caregiver through deportation or immigration, had a serious medical procedure or life-threatening illness, seen or heard violence in the neighborhood or in your school neighborhood, being detained, arrested, or incarcerated, being treated badly because of race, sexual orientation, place of birth, disability, or religion, experienced verbal or physical abuse or threats from a romantic partner? How do you think Lisa would score on that scale? The questions come from a scale that measures what's called ACEs on the screen there. Adverse childhood experiences. The original ACEs studies were groundbreaking because they stopped looking at the impact of individual adverse events on young people and instead widened the view to consider the cumulative effects of multiple adverse events on development. More specifically, the original ACEs work considered the impact of childhood abuse, psychological, physical, and sexual, as well as exposure to forms of household dysfunction, such as substance abuse in the home, mental illness in the home, witnessed spousal abuse, and criminal behavior in the home. On disease risk factors and incidence, quality of life, healthcare utilization, and mortality. It was fascinating because they found that the number of adverse childhood exposures had a dose-response relationship with both the number of health risk factors for leading causes of death in adults, for example, like substance use, depression, suicide, smoking, STIs, obesity, sexual promiscuity, as well as disease conditions in adults. So heart disease, cancer, lung disease, liver disease, fractures, and poor self-related health. For example, they said that if you had 4 or more ACEs, you could take 20 years off your life expectancy. Think about how many ACEs Lisa already has at her age. And racism and systemic racist practices are special, insidious types of ACEs. ACEs not only include forms of household dysfunction, but also multiple forms of environmental and community-based dysfunction. Without the conceptualization that Lisa has experienced multiple forms of anti-Black racism, and that this is traumatic, and that this has an impact on behavior, we're left continuing to view her like Medea in the Diary of a Mad Black Woman. Without the conceptualization about what's happened to her, we forget that something else might be underlying the ODD diagnosis and all those problem behaviors that we see, and that context actually matters. Okay, and we have the data to support this, right? For example, amongst 519 adolescent males in a juvenile detention center, 17% had previously received the sole diagnosis of conduct disorder. However, when assessed for other mental health conditions, 92% met criteria for either major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD, or had a history of a manic episode or panic attack. And this is backed by several other studies showing that Black youth in the justice system have high rates of undiagnosed, untreated, comorbid affective disorders and post-traumatic stress. So why do we miss this? Because we don't focus on the history of invalidation, the othering, the hurt. All we see is the tip of that angry iceberg. And meanwhile, Lisa is suffering behind these ACEs, and her body is being put in a state of chronic stress. Okay. So just a quick word on stress. I kind of want to belabor it. A lot of you are probably already familiar with this stuff. Our children need stress, right? It helps to teach resiliency, right? You don't want the first time that your child faces adversity to be when they're 18 and not have learned and developed the coping skills to manage the stress those situations produce, right? Additionally, our bodies have a stress response system that is very, very adaptive and responds quickly to threats in our environment, right? Take a moment, just consider the world without fear or anxiety, right? We have to have it. Fear protects us from harm. Without fear, nothing would stop me from walking into the middle of the street or driving 200 kilometers an hour. Anxiety is about the anticipation of a feared outcome, and without anxiety, I wouldn't have prepared for this talk. Our body's stress response system sends fear signals to the brain, which activates hormones that help to produce and prepare our body for action. It's efficient and necessary for human survival. You know, the book, like zebras don't have ulcers, you could think about that kind of stuff. So, you know, I'm walking in the park, I see a snake in the grass and run screaming for my life, but what if there's no snake in the grass? And instead I just think there's one. Right? Stress becomes toxic when it's frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled. Living with all these ACEs in the middle of community violence, abandonment, receiving messages that you're no good, failing school, all of that's placing the body in a chronic state of stress. And eventually, children in the Black community have learned to experience threat and the subsequent distress even at times where maybe there is none. Just think of me, just like me, thinking that there's a snake in the grass. At toxic levels, stress hormones are no longer preparing the body for action in healthy ways. High levels of cortisol and other stress-related hormones start to affect sleep, weight, immune function, and over time, you start seeing the health-related effects noted in the ACEs studies. But some of you might be wondering, well, how does this affect behavior? Well, there's also an impact on brain functioning. Imaging studies show impact on the frontal lobe, which is the executive system of the brain. The executive does exactly what it sounds like it does. It organizes higher order thinking, initiates tasks, inhibits responses. Okay. So no wonder our Black children are getting overdiagnosed with ODD or looked at as disruptive, or the ADHD diagnosis as well. Imaging studies actually show also impairments to the amygdala and hippocampus. These are the brain's emotion and memory centers. No wonder we see difficulties with emotion regulation and distress tolerance. Impact to the nucleus accumbens is also being seen. And this is the body's reward and pleasure center. So we see concerns with addiction, immediate gratification, and other impulsive and high-risk behaviors. There's also new research on epigenetics in ACEs, looking at how our genes are expressed differently because of toxic stress. These are not excuses for behavior, but rather they're a piece to the explanation. And I believe, and you're going to hear me say this probably 1,000 times today, that our conceptualization drives our intervention. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. But so if you're a therapist and Lisa arrives at your office referred by the school for lots of behavioral problems or by the CAS for the same reason, your explanation will guide your intervention. If you think of her as a behavior problem, then she will end up receiving a behavioral solution. However, if you're curious and get to know her and what she might be at risk for, and learn that this is a child with a number of ACEs, now we can reconceptualize things. Looking at her as a trauma survivor whose brain function might have been altered by toxic levels of stress in her body allows us to start thinking about additional avenues for intervention. So, in some ways, my heart breaks for Rich more than them all. It breaks for them all, but let's talk a little bit about what happens to Lisa. Again, this is cross-sectional, but what happens to Lisa if we don't pay attention to her trauma and other affective related conditions? That's Rich. Okay. Rich is the result of us not paying attention to ACEs and not having some humility in how we approach clients with differing cultural and ethnic backgrounds. I met Rich while I was working at a facility for young people in Southern Ontario. And this facility was interesting because it was part youth justice and part secure treatment. Rich was sent to the youth justice side for assault and some drug and weapons charges. He was 16 at the time, of East African descent, was very close to his family and his younger brother. His older brother was always in trouble with his older brother was in trouble with the law and in and out of correctional facilities. Parents were immigrants to the country, and prior to the charges, were living in a notoriously violent community in Toronto. And he grew up around a lot of violence and drugs in the community. He had a single grade 9 credit, which he received while in the facility. He's never tested, but probably had an undiagnosed learning disability. Was in and out of school and behavioral placements with the TDSB most of his life. Most of our work was on the exacerbation of his depressed mood while living separately from his family, locked up, his poor self-concept, especially related to academics, some advocacy to get him assessed. We did a lot of that while he was there. And we tried to capitalize on his interest in cars and build some behavior activation around that, and plans for mastery around that once he left. We also worked on his really unstable identity and lack of clarity around his values, which is making him more vulnerable to peer influence. Now, you can follow where some of that comes from. But without some awareness of the tendency for systems to overdiagnose disruptive disorders, and the expression of genuine curiosity regarding his life with some integration of his history and how he was treated within systems in Canada, I'm not sure we would have got to working on the things we actually worked on and supporting him in developing a life that's worth living for him. Prior to my involvement, actually, he'd gone through like multiple rounds of anger management from the facility, which was a common thing for a lot of the youth on that side of the facility. But even more interesting than all of that, right, was what was happening on the other side of the facility, which is what I really want to get to. Because I can't really talk about Rich without at least giving some mention of Peter, right? So Peter was a 16-year-old white youth. He grew up in a more rural suburban area of Southern Ontario, also had learning issues and lots of academic troubles, but no behavioral classes, just a lot of truancy, not showing up, hanging out at the smoker's corner. He was later arrested for assaulting a peer at school with a weapon. It wasn't a gun. He was found with multiple substances on him in his locker at arrest. He received a diversion for this, which a lot of kids do. And I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, whether or not he was charged. But he ended up in hospital sometime later because of really violent behavior and property destruction in his home, and subsequently received a secure treatment order and took a week detoxing when he arrived at the facility. So, Rich, Peter, right? Don't some of the symptoms sound the same? Why is it that Peter gets a secure treatment order and Rich has this history of institutionalization? The impact of our power differential as mental health service providers is that Rich and other Black youth disproportionately end up receiving the stick. And some of this starts with me at the age of 7 when I sit down with Caleb and further perpetuate the stereotype that he's a savage. And what do savages deserve? Well, they deserve chains. We know that these approaches cause differential access to care. There's tons of literature on that. If the problem is behavior, then I will apply a behavioral solution. Repeatedly, the outcomes for Black youth include something that has a poor prognosis. Same story over and over. Some studies show an upwards of 60% of incarcerated youth are diagnosed with cognitive disorder, and we know that Black youth are disproportionately represented in jails. In my own study, 65% of the incarcerated youth who participated in the study self-identified as an ethnic minority, and the majority of those were of Afro-Caribbean descent. It's the same thing with psychosis. Black people are 13 times more likely to have a forced hospital admission for psychosis than white people in the United States. There's a book, it's called The Deepest Well. It's written by Dr. Nadine Burke. I don't know if some of you read it, it's a great book. Dr. Burke provides us with this poignant quote. If 100 people all drink from the same well and 98 of them develop diarrhea, I can write prescription after prescription for antibiotics, or I can stop and ask, well, what the hell is in the well? So we keep trying to produce Band-Aid solutions that address the behavior that we see in Black children, or solutions based on what we think the problem is. And mostly these solutions are based on piecemeal information, maybe because the issue hasn't mattered enough to us until now, or maybe we're too busy to be curious. Or our solutions are generated from implicit biases or other unhelpful beliefs about Black children, lazy, violent, truant. But without the conceptualization that these kids have experienced multiple forms of anti-Black racism, and that that's traumatic, and that this has an impact on behavior, we're left giving prescription after prescription, which alleviates symptoms that the dominant culture considers unsavory, but never addresses the underlying causes. And these prescriptions have taken on various forms over the years, right? Strong medicines, like apprehension, incarceration, suspension, expulsion. Pacifying medicines, like sending to police diversion or anger management. But these medicines all address symptoms and do not tackle what's actually in the well. The water is tainted. It's poisoned with a litany of traumatic events, at the core of which are both systemic anti-Black racism, as well as situational racial traumas, which have produced the symptoms that we see today. What is in our well? So I want you to all think about that for a moment. Right? Think about our own practices. What would you do If Rich were referred to you post-discharge from jail, what would you think? Would you know where to start? What would you focus on in treatment? What has this beast-like conceptualization of his needs done to how we approach things? Again, how we understand the problem will determine what we do with it. I'll say this 1,000 times. Our formulation guides our intervention. Additionally, there's a history of researchers and clinicians considering Black clients to be poor candidates for therapy due to lack of insight, poor impulse control, paranoia, all this other stuff. Not being psychologically minded, it's not right. We actually compound these problems with access to care in the Black community as well. With some of the sentiments that we hold, studies suggest that Blacks are less likely than whites to seek out treatment for an affective disorder, substance abuse, or PTSD due to distrust with healthcare systems. I know I'm getting short on time here, but quickly, when I first set up my practice, I put on my business card, Dr. K. Belfon. Again, not proud of a lot of stuff. Why did I do that? Well, concerns that I have a racialized name and that I would be discriminated against before I even got in the door, just based on my name, and not believing that I would have enough Black clients to support a mental health practice. Now, I had to wrestle with that issue, and I was wrong on all kinds of levels to feed into that narrative. But what I think was more fair is this idea that Black people have a healthy cultural mistrust of systems. Unfortunately, this mistrust also interferes with the access to services when they really need it, even sometimes when the person looks like us. I was born in St. Lucia, and my family still refers to mental health institutions as asylums. Right. My mom asked me several years ago, and this is after seeing me go through 4 years of undergrad, 3 years of a clinical master's, and 5 years of a clinical PhD. So what are you again? A psychologist? A psychiatrist? And as a Black community, it's getting better, but we still have these stereotypes about what mental health is. So I'm gonna, with the balance of the time, and I wanna leave a few minutes for questions also, I wanna talk a little bit about intervention, okay? So Caleb's experience is really unfortunate because it teaches us about our own implicit biases and the impact it has on our myopic view towards formulating kids as disruptive, okay? Then Lisa teaches us that our explanation drives our intervention and that we often ignore internalizing problems in Black youth, which as a result places us, these kids down unhelpful paths, which is where we find Rich in a very unhelpful path. So for the last half of the session, last 10 minutes of the session, I'd like to work through how we can set aside the alphabet soup a little bit of diagnostic labels and see if we can instead focus a bit more on understanding kids within their current and historical context, okay? With an ethical view that recognizes that the things we do and the way we conceptualize Black children might be related to our own unconscious biases, and that this actually has a real impact on future planning. Okay, so let's spend about 5 minutes doing this. Let's take a look here. So, how do we address this? First, as mental health providers, it starts with us. What are my own implicit biases? Again, Amy probably didn't realize these things until after that moment occurred. What is my own cultural identity? How does it shape my worldview? How does my background help or interfere with my connection to clients? How do I make space in my practice for clients to name their own identities? How much do I value input from my clients? What do I learn about myself by listening to clients who are different than me? These are just a few, but notice these are all about me, me, me. There are these implicit association tasks that I mentioned earlier that you can do online to help sort some of this thing out, okay? And then what are we actually doing about our biases after we're aware of them? Awareness alone is not enough. Okay. Research has shown that there are some short interventions, okay, like imagining counter-stereotypic examples, perspective taking, or stereotype replacement activities. But We've been subject basically to millions of opportunities for associative learning that have produced these biases. So thinking about a counter stereotypic example a couple of times is not going to be sufficient. Patricia Devine has a framework for this, and she refers to it as implicit biases as habits, okay, which we have to go about the process of breaking. And to break the habit, awareness is not enough. So you can't only understand what you did to Caleb, you also need to be concerned or feel guilty about, guilt can be useful here, about the consequences of your habits. So you also need to understand what has happened to Rich, which is the consequence of our habits. And while thinking about Barack Obama, when you're having a judgment about Black people that fits with Sambo, that's a good start. But just like a treatment course of CBT, this is a practice that needs to be committed to. So to recap here, the first step is to be aware of our biases and having some accountability to doing something about them. Okay. Second, how you understand the systems you work in. And we inadvertently perpetuate oppressive practices with our policies. When I pick up the phone to call CS or the police because that's a legal requirement or a policy, am I thinking about Lisa? Do the policies think about Lisa? When we know that Black youth are disproportionately represented in our jails and in societal care, I'm not saying that we don't have to call, but are you even thinking about those things before you do? And what are we doing as a system to advocate for a better way? Our tools and our practices as clinicians are not colorblind. There's no such thing. Martin Luther King Jr. saying that we should be judged by the contents of our character, not the color of our skin, is not a license for us to call all of the tools, structures, and treatments we use universal. They're not. And awareness and some humility to this is, in fact, step 2. Third, and only after self-reflective practice, how can we start to contextualize the suffering of Black youth and come up with treatment plans that are sensitive to that context? You know, American literature points to so many atrocities, right? 400 years of slavery, Black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, legal lynchings, medical experimentation, like Tuskegee experiments, redlining, disenfranchisement, brutality by police, unequal treatment of just at every level of society. And Black youth in Canada, while not suffering the same history of slavery in this country, you know, believe me, Black youth did not escape this. And Black people who are here in Canada now did not escape this. There's a lengthy history of slavery in the West Indies as well. St. Lucia, where I was born, we had slavery until 1838 and weren't fully emancipated from colonial rule or whatever until 1979. And Black people, of course, here have a shared history around systemic discrimination in Canada, serial migration, public schools, high rates of incarceration, etc. So the consideration of this into how history affects the present is actually critically important to our formulations. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with this slide, actually. Humility, okay. Most of what I talked about in the last slide is related to practicing some humility. At the same time, at the same youth justice facility that I mentioned earlier, everyone was excited when I joined the team. And you should always be a little bit wary when you start working somewhere and people get excited. Run. Okay. But the enthusiasm was related to having little diversity on the clinical team and the opportunity to do some racial matching with kids on the wait list for therapy. And I bought into this, had a few Black kids from the justice side on my caseload, those who were willing. Mostly they came because they thought it would be a good look for court. Anyway, maybe me being Black helped some of them have familiarity and trust and also helped them get in the door. But beyond that, I might not have had anything in common with them at all. Just because I'm Black, it doesn't mean that I have a shared experience in the world, perhaps beyond the systemic racism. So we have to get beyond this dated thinking that culturally sensitive care involves somehow mastering or our understanding of Black youth. Knowing about group differences alone is not sufficient to assessing and working with youth of diverse backgrounds. And it's impossible to know everything you need to know about any individual. This is potentially very invalidating. And by focusing on mastery, we don't become more aware of our own biases and power differentials. Instead, cultural humility challenges the idea that there's some discrete endpoints to being competent and that we need to acquire knowledge about Black people to be competent. Instead, it emphasizes the problems in the therapy room are not because of a lack of knowledge. Who cares if you know whether or not the client likes to eat oxtail? Rather, problems arise from us not understanding our own biases and systemic biases towards Black clients. The issue is that I don't realize that somewhere deep, I was looking at Caleb like a savage too. The issue is that I don't realize that my tools are made and normed with white people and are Eurocentric in nature. The issue is that I don't realize that some of the diagnostic categories just serve to further alienate Black youth and put them on a trajectory to jail. The issue is that neither myself nor broader systems that I engage with are being held to an account for addressing inequities in care. Action on inequalities. For example, the applicability of the reports and documents that we generate. That's just one example. There's a clinic in Oakland that writes personal letters to clients in response to the original referral. That's cool because it targets the intervention of healing at the site of the language itself, where those who experience suffering express it using their own language derived from their own lived worlds and communities. Anyways, I know I've got 1 minute or 2 minutes. I think I'll actually end there. But if I were to leave you with anything to think about, it's start by thinking about ourselves. Have some more humility. We don't need to know everything, right? I can absolve you of your guilt around that. You know, we don't need to know everything, but we need to be curious and acknowledge our own biases and take action against our own biases and start thinking how we can incorporate part of what we have learned about our own biases and systemic biases and integrate those things into our formulations and our work with kids, with Black kids. So thank you for your time. I know it's 4 o'clock. I don't know if we have a few minutes, Joanne, for questions. I was a little bit more chatty than I thought.
Well, we have one question, and then unfortunately we will have to move on to the next session, but we have a participant who has asked, how can people connect with you? And can you tell us a little bit about the types of services or programs that you offer?
Yeah, so I'm the Associate Clinical Director at CDI, and so certainly we can circulate my email address maybe after the fact, Joanne, to people who have come to the I'm hoping that people have emailed in. I'm not sure, but I can certainly leave my email address for folks. You can find me at CDI. Yeah, I also have a private practice, but that's in Durham region, but certainly people can reach out through CDI. Programs that we offer. So, you know, that's a loaded question. There are some programs that target, that are developed by or have been adjusted by Black professionals for Black youth. I think, though, that the individual work that we do, that really does start with us in terms of us having some humility at the gate in terms of how we think about the work, how we think about our own biases, and how we apply that to our formulation. So I would say that starting with some individual work is probably what I would suggest. And there aren't enough programs that are developed by Black people for Black youth. I would also agree with that.
Thank you very, very much. That was a truly fascinating and thought-provoking session. And thank you I've shared Dr. Belfon's email in the chat, and the presentation will be posted on the Strides Toronto Lead Agency website. So there will be more chances for you to share this with your colleagues because I think there's a lot of important information that was shared in this session today. So once again, thank you, Dr. Belfon. We really appreciate it. I'm going to hand over to Sierra Johnson, who's going to introduce our next presenter.